Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're watching from. We're glad you're here. My name is Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of our leadership team, I am pleased to welcome you to tonight's program. Having just returned from the Northeast of the United States, I hope our audience in those parts are enduring the frigid temperatures. While it's not exactly sunny and warm today in California, after experiencing 20-degree weather with snow flurries, our 60 degrees here feels nice and toasty. Stay warm. A special welcome and thank you to today's guest, the remarkable constitutional law scholar and Dean of UC Berkeley School of Law, Erwin Chemerinsky. Welcome and thanks as well to our wonderful moderator, Larry Mantle of NPR Southern California affiliate, LAist. Thank you both for being with us to help us grapple with tonight's very important, serious, and disturbing topic, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on college campuses. Next week, January 23rd, we will host political analyst, author, blogger, and podcaster Damon Linker, who will be in conversation with Warren Olney. The topic, 2024, another year in defiance of political reality. It's a question. Recently, Linker published a column in the New York Times in which he introduced us to the top intellectual conservatives whose ideas are the guiding lights for Trump and MAGA. Linker is a former Republican. He teaches in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He writes 3 subscription newsletters at Substack. I'm sorry about that. Eyes on the Right, Looking Left, and Above the Fray under the collective title of Notes from the Middle Ground. He's a weekly podcaster on The Bulwark, and he's fascinating and will bring a very unique perspective to our audience. In tonight's email, I provide you a link to the New York Times article I just mentioned. It has no paywall. It's a startling article, and you might want to read it before next week's program. After Linker, we continue with a great lineup, and I'm just going to quickly mention what they are. January 31st, we have Ron Brownstein and Stuart Stephen with Pat Morrison. Then on February 5th, we'll have our 8th Israel in Crisis program with Aaron David Miller and Rabbi David Wolpe. And then we have Brett Stevens and Madeline Brand addressing a topic related to tonight, anti-Semitism globally as well as domestically. Links to all of those programs are in the email you'll get after tonight's program. Also, remember that Zoom link comes to you directly from Zoom, not from Judge. Please look in your spam for the email because it's probably there if you can't find it in your inbox. Zoom sends 3 emails, one as you register, one 24 hours before the program starts, and one hour before the program starts. All 3 contain the join webinar link. So if you registered and didn't get the Zoom emails, and it's not in your spam, register again because it probably didn't work the first time. And if you register within 30 minutes before the program starts, a big join webinar link will be sent to you, which makes it very easy to join. Now, please welcome my friend and a critical member of our America at a Crossroads leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, who will introduce tonight's guests. Mel?
Thanks, Janice. We are really pleased to have Dean Erwin Chemerinsky as our speaker tonight. Erwin has had an extraordinary legal career encompassing work in the U.S. Department of Justice, work in private practice, work as a law professor at DePaul at USC and Duke, and then as dean at UC Irvine, and now at UC Berkeley, affectionately known as Cal. While doing all of this, Erwin has also published 11 books. I have spoken over the years with a great number of his colleagues and his students at SC, Irvine, and Cal, and they always praise not only his extraordinary talent, and the breadth and depth of his knowledge of the law, but they also seem always to mention his warmth and his relationship with his students. He is, I have learned, universally respected and admired by his students and his colleagues, and we are extremely fortunate to have him as our speaker this evening. Our wonderful moderator, Larry Mantle, needs no introduction to this audience. He is one of our frequent moderators for which we are very grateful and appreciative. Larry has been the radio host of Air Talk Larry Mantle on NPR station KPCC since 1985. Air Talk is the longest running daily talk show in Southern California, and with good reason. During those 39 years, Larry has been the recipient of numerous awards for his superb journalism, and I turn the program over now to Larry.
Thank you so much, Mel. Thank you, Janice and Zev as well. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and particularly good for me to have the experience of speaking again with Dean Chemerinsky, who for decades has been joining me regularly on our Air Talk program to discuss important issues in the law and legal education. As we discuss anti-Semitism this evening, I want to begin by paying tribute to the co-founder of this series, David Lehrer, who we lost last year. He was dedicated to addressing anti-Semitism's rise when he saw it, while taking a highly objective approach to the issue. It's safe to say that all of us with this series continue to grieve his passing and what he brought to very important discussions like this. Dean Chemerinsky, so good to talk with you again. And as I was just saying about David, I've always appreciated your approach to hateful speech, recognizing its corrosive effects, the psychological harm that it does, while also advocating for freedom of speech, even despicable speech. We'll get to that challenging question of what crosses the line into a threat, but I'd like to start with your own recent experiences. Since the October 6th Hamas attack on Israeli civilians, you've written in the LA Times and talked on my program about anti-Semitism targeted at you. For those who haven't read that op-ed in the Times or heard you describe those incidents, please tell us how UC Berkeley changed for you after the attack.
Let me start by saying what an honor and pleasure it is to be on this program, and how wonderful, Larry, it is to always get to talk with you. October 7th was deeply disturbing for all of us, but I was shocked on October 8th when my law students for justice in Palestine and students for justice in Palestine all over the country put out statements celebrating what Hamas had done. I was also surprised in the days that followed to see anti-Semitism in my school and directed at me. Let me give you some examples. I put out a statement on Monday, October 9th, that began by saying I was horrified by the terrorism that had occurred in Israel, and saying we need to express support for all who have loved ones in the Middle East, and that we as a school need to treat one another with respect and compassion. I was immediately criticized over social media and at meetings for calling it terrorism, where some of my students said it was part of a war on liberation. At one of those meetings, a student said to me, "I feel unsafe in the law school." And I said, "What can we do to make you feel safe?" And she said, "Get rid of all the Zionists here." And I have to say that I and the other Jewish students in the room felt that it was like saying, get rid of the Jews. A couple of days later, somebody put on Instagram a picture of me in combat makeup saying I had taken an indefinite leave from being Dean of Berkeley Law to join the IDF. I had not experienced these things in my law school or any law school where I've taught over 44 years of being a law professor. And it's what caused me to write that piece in the LA Times that you mentioned.
And we should say you're someone who has been very free with criticism of the Israeli government. You have not been a cheerleader for the Netanyahu administration, and you've been very open with your criticism of Israel's policies relative to the Palestinians.
I very strongly support Palestinian rights. I very strongly support a two-state solution. I'm critical of the Netanyahu administration, and yet when it came to October 7th, I believe that there is no defense of what Hamas did. It was brutal and unacceptable terrorism. And it was very disturbing to me that calling it such it was described by some of my students as being racist and Islamophobic.
So how did we get to this point where instead of students just coming back and saying, well, please share with us why you see it as terrorism. Why do you think it fits that definition? I, as a student, wouldn't call it that. How do we get the point where they couldn't just challenge your use of the term without saying that they felt unsafe and that they felt Zionists were threatening to other students?
I think the answer to that is very complicated. And I think we have to resist a simplistic solution. I think some of it is at this moment in time, the students who are on the Palestinian side, they very much are opposing the existence of Israel. And of course, there are other students and faculty, and I'm among them, who believe that the existence of Israel is essential and essential for the Jewish people. But I think it's important to see how much this has changed in those last couple of years. Until the last couple of years, I would say the debate over Israel was about settlements on the West Bank, but whether there should be a two-state solution, how to get there. But now it's opposition to the very existence of Israel. And there is no bridge between those who believe to an entirely Palestinian state and those who believe that Israel should exist. I also think that part of it is the line between what's against Israel and what's just flat out anti-Semitic is a fine line. And sometimes things that seem to be expressing a position with regard to Israel just are unequivocally anti-Semitic. And I'll add a couple of other dimensions to this in answering your question and why it's complicated. I think that my generation has not done a very good job of explaining why the existence of Israel is so important. Also, I think we've got to accept that the policies of the Netanyahu government have helped to fuel anti-Israel sentiment that, as I said, sometimes cross over into anti-Semitism.
One of the things you called for in your op-ed in the LA Times was for administrators at your school to condemn anti-Semitism, to use their right to free speech to condemn it. There are concerns about administrators inserting themselves into politics and choosing sides, so to speak. What convinced you in this case that hateful comments, anti-Semitic rhetoric needed the administration to speak up about it?
I think it's important to note that this op-ed came out, I think it was on October 29th. And I was stunned in that month between October 7th and October 29th at how much administrators across the country were silent. The defense of Hamas was shocking and unacceptable. Some of the anti-Semitic incidents that occurred on campuses were shocking and unacceptable, and yet there was silence by administrators across the country. Subsequent to this, more administrators have spoken out against the anti-Semitism, but it was that silence that I felt required a response. More generally, in answer to your question, I think that what administrators need to speak out is when their silence is the wrong message. Administrators can't speak out about everything all the time, but there are instances where to say nothing is a message and the wrong message. After the tragic death of George Floyd in May 2020, I felt that I, as an administrator, needed to speak out. After January 6th, I felt that I, as an administrator, needed to speak out. And in the face of silence about the anti-Semitism in October of 2023, I felt the need to speak out.
Erwin, let's talk about how universities generally have responded to this. I know you're most familiar with what's happened on your campus, but we've had recent surveys that have been conducted first by the ADL and Hillel, looking at how Jewish students felt about their campus experiences, that showing a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic experiences and perceptions among students. And then we had Brandeis University with a survey of students, and there's been some critique of the pool of students that was used for that, because it's about the education program going back to Israel for that. Nonetheless, that too shows what the 2,000 plus students perceive of their campuses. And if you look at the schools that are in the highest 25% of schools where anti-Semitic hostility is perceived by the students, UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC San Diego. And then if you go to the next 25% highest, UC Davis, UC Santa Barbara, USC is on the list. So what is it about the University of California that seems to put their numbers so high in the perception of students as being an anti-Semitic environment?
I've talked to deans and university presidents across the country. I don't think that it's different at Berkeley or UCLA or UC San Diego than it is at Columbia or NYU or Harvard. I think that nationally, there's been an increase in anti-Semitic incidents. This is documented by the ADL. It's documented by law enforcement. I think on campuses, there's been a very vocal pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel sentiment expressed. And as I said, often it's not just about policies. Now it's about the very existence of Israel, and it often crosses the line into clearly anti-Semitic speech. But I think it's a mistake to say that it's different at the UC schools than it is at any of the other large universities.
You've got a pair of lawsuits, at least last I checked, two of them against UC Berkeley for creating an anti-Semitic environment. According to the lawsuits that have been filed, Department of Education is actually looking, I believe, at 3 different universities over allegations that they have not been able to create a safe environment for their Jewish students. When you look at those lawsuits, do you think that there's merit in them at Cal?
First, the Department of Education complaint filed against Berkeley for the Hamilton Law School has been dismissed. There is a lawsuit pending, and it's a bit complicated about what it's about, but in order to explain why I don't think it's merit, I need to explain.
Sure.
In August of 2022, our Law Students for Justice in Palestine chapter encouraged student organizations to adopt a bylaw that they would not invite speakers that supported, quote, Zionism, comma, the apartheid state of Israel, comma, or the Palestinian occupation. My position then and was that student organizations get to choose speakers on the basis of their viewpoint. The Federalist Society, a conservative group, can choose to invite conservative speakers. The Women's Law Association could choose to invite only pro-choice speakers. And indeed, there's Supreme Court precedents that have made this clear. On the other hand, when it comes to student organizations that receive academic credit or law journals or are published by the university, I said they can't get credit or be published by the university if they restrict their authors or do things that are inconsistent with credit. I think this is the position the First Amendment requires, but it's that policy that was the basis for the lawsuit that you mentioned that was filed against Berkeley and the University of California in December. And I don't believe it has merit because I believe that the First Amendment has required us to take the position that I've just described to you.
Speaking of the First Amendment, there have been pro-Palestinian groups that have been decertified on some campuses because of the rhetorical positions that they've taken or perceptions that they've out and out threatened Jewish students. Do you think that, I mean, with your support for free speech, that those measures have gone too far?
Yes, but I think we've got to draw a distinction here between public and private universities. Public universities are covered by the First Amendment to the Constitution. Private universities don't have to comply with the Constitution. There may be other sources of law that regulate private universities. In California, there's a statute called the Leonard Law that says that private universities can't punish speech, that public universities can't punish because of the First Amendment. Also, private universities have faculty and student handbooks that are contracts with faculty and students that might provide free speech protection. But there is a key distinction with regard to speech between public and private universities. Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida has said that public universities there cannot have chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine. I think that clearly violates the First Amendment, that students have a First Amendment freedom of association right to join Students for Justice in Palestine, and students have the right to advocate for Palestinians. They have the right to advocate against the existence of Israel. They even have the right to say hateful things, however much, as you said early in the program, that causes great harm.
We had the testimony of the 3 college presidents before a congressional panel, which is led over the longer term, 2 of those presidents to step down at Penn and at Harvard. The MIT president continues on. They had a very difficult time articulating what they needed to do to create a safe environment for their Jewish students versus protections of freedom of speech. And they fell into legalese, and clearly there had been some coaching by attorneys at the schools. if you were the one testifying on behalf of your school, how would you have defined it?
Let me say Monday morning quarterbacking is really easy. I'm answering your question with the opportunity to reflect. It's very different to have been sitting there a couple hours into the hearing and answering. But I think what's important is the question by Representative Stefanik asked for an emotional answer, and they gave a logical response, and their response didn't play well as a soundbite. I think what I would have said is that my campus unequivocally condemns any advocacy of genocide. Should it ever occur on my campus, I would speak out, and I'm sure my chancellor would speak out against it. I'm Jewish. I had relatives on both sides of my family die in the Holocaust, so I'm enormously sensitive to this. But when we talk about when can the campus punish speech, it's very different. That merely advocating an idea, even a repugnant one, can't be punished in a public university. That said, if advocacy of genocide can meet the test for incitement or a true threat or harassment, then it's unprotected by the First Amendment.
So what role do administrators then have, Erwin, to thread that needle between trying to have a safe place where students feel they're not under threat, where they're not being attacked verbally or otherwise, and at the same time, free speech is not being constrained, even if it's despicable free speech? How does administration walk that line?
And I will answer directly, but let me start by saying a couple of times now you've used the word unsafe, and I want to address that directly, and then I'll come to your specific question.
Okay.
Because now, whenever I hear from my students that they're upset or offended, they phrase it as, I feel unsafe. And as I talk to deans on my campus, deans across the country, other university administrators, this has now become common. And I think it is enormously important to separate physical safety from being protected from ideas that might offend one. In fact, I sent a message to the whole law school community on the first day of the semester, a week ago Monday, that talked about free speech. And I said, we have the obligation to do what we can to protect the physical safety and security of our students. And although thankfully there have been no incidents or threats in my law school, we have done things to increase security. But it's not the role of a university to protect students from ideas or speech that might offend them. It cannot be our duty to make students safe from that which might upset them. And I think it is so important when we talk about safety to draw that distinction. Now,
So
let me go ahead, please.
just before you answer the other part, then where does that leave us on the perception that physical harm might happen, but there hasn't actually been an incident of physical harm?
I think here what campus needs to do is take steps to make sure there's protection of physical safety, and also to let students know what's being done to increase physical safety. We increased the presence of security guards within the law school after October 7th. And it was because we were afraid of what might happen, but also wanted students to feel their physical safety was protected. When it comes to Hillels or Chabads on campus, it's so important that campuses provide protection of physical safety. When there are demonstrations that might lead to incidents, campuses have the obligation to make sure that they've provided for security forces to help provide for physical safety. Now, in terms of how do campus officials thread the needle, I don't want to oversimplify. I think it's very difficult, but I think there are some things that campus officials have to do. First, they have to have clear free speech policies, and they need to express that all ideas and views can be expressed on the campus. Second, when there is hateful speech, when there is speech of the sort that we're talking about, that is still protected by the First Amendment, but it causes real harm, campus officials need to speak out. They have a bully pulpit. That was the point of the op-ed piece that you mentioned, where I said that I thought campus officials needed to speak out and condemn anti-Semitism. Third, we're educational institutions. We have to provide educational programs. We should all be providing programs about the history of the Middle East. I'm stunned at how little my students on all sides know about the background of the Middle East. I remember in early November talking to a group of students and saying it happened to be the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, the time in 1917 when England said there would be a Jewish state where Israel's located. Not one of the students I was talking to had ever heard of the Balfour Declaration. We need to have programs where those who take the Law Students and Justice in Palestine side express it, and we need to have programs that take the side of what Israel is doing now. We're defending the existence of Israel, but we as educational institutions must do that. And finally, we've got to provide support for our students. I think with regard to Jewish students, this is places where Hillels and Chabads are very important. It's places where things like the Jewish Law Student Association in my law school is important. But also, I felt the need to increase the mental health resources available for our students, again, on all sides. One of the things that we haven't touched on is the reality. We have many students in my school and on campus who have relatives and loved ones in Israel and in Gaza. We have students who have lost loved ones. We have students who have family members who are being held hostage. They need emotional and mental health support, and that too the campus has to do.
Erwin, I want to talk about the use of the term genocide to describe the IDF's military action in Gaza. And it feels to me a bit like sort of trying to use a rhetorical trump card, so to speak, to describe it, as opposed to explaining why this would actually, in their view, fall under the description of genocide. How does that term get used on your campus?
My Law Students for Justice in Palestine, and more generally on campus, a group called Bears for Palestine, used the word genocide to describe what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I think they do so for exactly the reason you say. Genocide has such rhetorical power. Of course, it does so particularly in a context where the Jewish people were the subject of a genocide that wiped out a third of all of the Jews in the world during World War II. And so I think they're using it just for the reasons that you say, because it is such a powerful way of expressing their criticism of what Israel is doing.
So if you say to those who describe it as genocide that, well, if Hamas were to free the hostages, were agreed to relinquish control after the attack on Israel and call for elections in Gaza, that would likely end the military action of Israel. What do they say that? If it's a genocide, the intent is to wipe out a people, not with a specific military goal in mind. So, what would their response be to that?
My Law Students for Justice in Palestine take the position that what Israel has been doing since 1948 is genocide against the Palestinian people. And they regard what's going on in Gaza as a continuation of that. So I think they would say it's, even if everything you mentioned happens and hopefully the hostages are released, I think we all hope there'll be peace there, they would still say that there is a genocide that's been going on. And of course, South Africa has filed a complaint alleging that Israel's engaged in genocide, and Israel has responded very forcefully, as recently as yesterday, denying that.
I want to get back to the use of the term anti-Zionism, because in my mind, and this may be incorrect, I think of Zionism, of the idea of a place for the Jewish people that is distinctly a Jewish place, which would require, to accommodate Palestinians, a two-state solution. So I would think of a one-state solution where it's essentially a democracy where everybody votes, and you wouldn't have a Jewish state because of demographics. That would not fit Zionism. So for someone who says, I support a one-state solution, I don't support there being a distinctly Jewish state. I believe Jews should be able to live alongside Palestinians, but there shouldn't be a Jewish run country. Is that anti-Semitic to hold that view, in your opinion?
It is the opinion that many of my students now express. There's a slogan that's become popular on campus, and I'm quoting it: "We don't want no two-state, we want 48. That refers to going back to 1948 when there was no Israel. And I think you're asking an enormously difficult question. Would eliminating Israel as a Jewish state be anti-Semitic? My answer to that, having given it a great deal of thought, is yes, that I think that the Jewish people do have a right to a Jewish state. And I think calls for eliminating Israel as a Jewish state. How would we get there? What really would it mean for the Jews? I strongly, as I said earlier, favor a two-state solution. I strongly favor there being a Palestinian state. But I think for many Jews, the existence of Israel as a Jewish state is a key part of their Jewish identity.
I want to take some questions from members of our audience because we always have so many terrific contributions. Let's see. Tom asks, doesn't the First Amendment restrict free speech that incites violence? Where is that line for Students for the Justice of Palestine?
Sure. You're right, of course, that incitement of illegal activity is not protected by the First Amendment. But the Supreme Court has articulated a test for that. It comes from a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969. And the Supreme Court says in order for speech to be incitement, there has to be a likelihood of imminent illegal activity, and the speech has to be directed at causing imminent illegal activity. So if my students in Justice in Palestine on campus urge the elimination of Israel, that's not the test that would meet the test for incitement. There has to be a likelihood of imminent illegal activity, and the speech has to be directed at causing imminent illegal activity. Now, imagine that there's a rally on campus and an angry crowd, and a speaker urges the crowd to commit acts of arson and vandalism, and it happens. Yeah, that would meet the test for incitement, but it's a test that's very speech protective. And I don't think that just the advocacy of the Students for Justice in Palestine would generally meet that test.
We've had a number of viewers who want to go back to the issue of where is that line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. You've said that being anti-Zionist or believing there isn't a right to a Jewish nation, you see that as anti-Semitic. Are there other things when it comes to criticism of Israel, the state, that would fall into that category of anti-Semitism?
I think that there is as much right to criticize Israel's policies without being anti-Semitic as there is to criticize the policies of the United States without being anti-American. I was certainly, often on your program, critical of the policies of Donald Trump, but I don't think that made me anti-American. I'm very critical of the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu, but I don't think that makes me anti-Israel. I can criticize what the federal government is doing, but I can also criticize what the Israeli government is doing. I do think, though, if the criticism is making disparaging comments about the Jewish people, we've then crossed from just criticizing a policy to making a generalization and an unflattering one about people on the basis of their religion and their ethnicity. That's anti-Semitic.
So in the same way that we sometimes hear rhetoric about particular reasons, oh, they're all a bunch of, these sorts of sweeping, condemning generalizations, similarly with Jews, this is obviously anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and it was surprising to me, though it shouldn't have been, after October 7th, how much some of the traditional anti-Semitic tropes got expressed in some of the support for Hamas, just some of the things that was said. Within my own law school, I heard said a couple of times that I was part of a Zionist conspiracy. That's part of an anti-Semitic trope. You can disagree with my policies, but when you start talking in those ways, or you start talking about some of the other things that have historically been anti-Jewish, I think that's crossed a line too.
So that kind of rhetoric feeds into the idea that there's this cabal that's pulling the strings on the world, and that Jews are intending to dominate the world. Are there other tropes that also have manifested on your campus?
Some of the things that I've heard on my campus and nationally said about Jews controlling money in the world, some of the things that have been said about some of the Jewish philanthropists in that way, again, they're feeding into age-old anti-Semitic tropes.
Let's talk a bit about what's happening with Iran. Jane asked, donations from Qatar, is that a factor in promoting anti-Semitism? Do you see anti-Semitism within the United States being stoked by the actions of those outside the country?
The honest answer is none of us can know. I mean, one of the interesting questions is who, for example, is providing funds for the Students in Justice in Palestine across the country? We don't know the answer to that. There certainly is somebody doing that, and there is speculation about where it comes from, but we don't know. We don't know to what extent Iran or other countries are fueling the sentiment. And I want to be clear, I think there is plenty to criticize Israel for what it's doing. But I also think that what we've seen since October 7th is tapping into an anti-Semitism that was there in a way that's ugly and very worrying.
According to the Brandeis survey that I mentioned earlier, Jewish students express far more concern about anti-Semitism directed from students on the political left than those on the political right. Part of that may be attributable to sheer numbers, just there are a lot more students holding views on the left at the schools we're talking about than the right. But we've also had progressive-minded speakers who've tried to or students, I should say, who've tried to shut down conservative speakers on campus, and they've tried to enforce their standard of what they consider to be acceptable conversation. You are someone on the left. You are one of the country's most notable liberal spokespeople. So how do you feel about what seems to be an intolerance coming more from people who share your political views in other areas?
Let me break your question down into a couple of parts. First, there is never a First Amendment right to use speech to silence others. There is no First Amendment right to heckle or shout down a speaker and keep them from being able to express their views. Is part of the message I send to my students every year. It explains if you disagree with a speaker, engage in a peaceful, non-disruptive protest. Bring in your own speakers. But if you disrupt, you face discipline because there's no right to have a heckler's veto. Second, I think one of the things that's happened in recent years is there's been a great deal of criticism from the left of Israel's policies in the very existence of Israel. Some of that, I said, is fueled by the policies of the Netanyahu government. Some of it is that the left has become more generally anti-Israel. I don't think there's more intolerance from the left than there is from the right. And my position, as you know, is that everyone should have the right to express their views. The left should be able to express it. Those on the right should be able to express it. That's what a campus should be about, a place where all ideas can be expressed.
There is the view that some hold, though, that many on the left who've grown up in an educational system that has really reinforced liberal principles in the classroom, that it's led to the shorthand in the view of many young people that who has the power, who has the resources, who has the money is de facto in a conflict the evil party, that whoever is the one that has less, that doesn't have as much power, is de facto the one that is fighting a good moral fight. And so I wonder, in the case of Israel and Hamas and Gaza, if we're seeing an extension of that view that sort of dumbs this down to that, you know, everybody who's poorer and has suffered more oppression has the moral high ground.
I certainly think you hear that expressed sometimes, but I also think there's a lot more going on than that. If you look at opinion polls, support for Israel is much lower among people under 30 than, say, those over 50. And it goes to something I said early in this conversation, Larry. I think my generation has done a poor job of explaining to younger generations why the existence of Israel is so important. And I'm now often confronted by even Jewish students who are very critical of the existence of Israel. And I think my generation deserves some of the blame for that. I think some of the policies of the Netanyahu government and of Israel in terms of things like the settlements on the West Bank, the failure to pursue a two-state solution is responsible for that. But I think some of it is also what you describe.
David asks, do you think Israel's response to the October attack has been proportional? Do you believe in the notion of proportionality? Do you think lack of proportionality is the cause of anti-Semitism?
Can I say I don't know? I've got to say, I thought that Israel after October 7th had to respond and had to respond forcefully against Hamas. And yet, when I look at what's happened in Gaza, the number of children who have died, the number of civilians who've died, the destruction, the question that I have to ask is, was it necessary to have this much destruction? Was it proportional? And here I just don't feel I know enough to have an answer.
Well, I think one of the big questions is what is proportional, because if Israel were to have responded in kind with the very same atrocities, people would not have accepted that as proportional, even if it was the exact same number of people kidnapped and assaulted and killed. I mean, this is, as you're saying, it is such a complex issue to even determine what proportionality is.
Right. And I'm also somebody who tries to speak where I have expertise, and I'm glad to talk about the First Amendment and glad to have this campus. I'm not somebody who knows enough to be able to assess whether or not Israel's military reaction was proper. I can say that I'm deeply disturbed by looking at the deaths in Gaza, and I can ask the question, was it necessary to have so much loss of civilian life in order to be able to fight against Hamas? There had to be a reaction against Hamas. There had to be a military effort. And of course, it couldn't be what Hamas did that was horrific beyond imagination.
Natalie says, my daughter was recently accepted at Berkeley Law, which she's thrilled about. Her and our concern is regarding how she'll fare on your campus. Will a young Jewish and Zionist woman find her place there? What community and resources exist for Jewish students at Berkeley Law? And what is your administration doing to ensure their safety and building a conducive learning environment?
I think I can say unequivocally yes to that, and that your daughter should get in touch with me. My email address is on the website, and I'm glad to talk about it. I would put her in touch with our students in the Jewish Law Students Association. Some of them I met with as recently as today. I would have her get in touch with our wonderful Hillel rabbi, who they're providing tremendous support to the Jewish students. I would have her come and spend time in the law school and see for herself. In terms of security within the school, as I mentioned, we've taken many steps to enhance the physical security, but I have to say we have had no threats within the law school. We've had no incidents within the law school. It's all trying to be preventative. But please, if she's got questions, she should just get in touch with me directly, and I'd be delighted to speak with her about this.
Karen asks, what is the role of many university professors who've been teaching, quote, anti-Zionist ideas for many years?
I don't believe that it's the role of professors to proselytize particular viewpoints. I taught class this morning at 8:30, and my view is I want a classroom to be a place where all ideas come out. That said, inevitably, there are times when my views are reflected in how I teach the material. But my hope is that campuses make clear that it's not the role to teach anti-Zionist or pro-Zionist viewpoints. I think that the campus has to be a place where all ideas and views get expressed and get respected.
What are the things you do as a professor when you are expressing your personal viewpoint about something to allow the students to have different views, to give them space? What are the things you try to do to make sure that your perspective doesn't overwhelm theirs?
I see a big distinction between what I do in the classroom and say what I write in an op-ed or what I say on your program. In my op-ed and on your program, I'm expressing my opinion. I try hard in the classroom to have both sides come out. And then I'll tell you the exception. So today's discussion, literally this morning, was about the debate between originalism and non-originalism in interpreting the Constitution. And I structured it as, what are the arguments in favor of originalism, and then what are the response to that? What are the arguments in favor of non-originalism and the response to that? Or take abortion, which is as controversial as any topic. When I cover it in constitutional law, I lay out 5 choices the Supreme Court had in dealing with it and structure the discussion in that way. There are obviously points where I do express my opinion. I condemn, say, Dred Scott versus Sanford, that held that enslaved persons were just property, not citizens. Or Korematsu versus the United States, where the Supreme Court upheld the evacuation and internment of Japanese Americans. Just this morning, I praised the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. So it's not that I'm always neutral, but I think in those instances, it would be hard to take any other position.
Phil asks, what responsibility do you take for having allowed students objecting to a speaker, either through disrupting or creating violence, causing the speaker to not be able to appear, and your college doing nothing to discipline those students?
I am proud that in my 7 years as dean at Berkeley, in my 9 years as dean at Irvine, 16 years, we have never had a disruption of a speaker. Now, I think some of that is because we announced a policy at the beginning of the year that disruption would be punished. Also, when we have a controversial speaker, we always have a very high-level administrator. So when we had a controversial speaker this fall, and it looked like there'd be a disruption, that administrator was there in the room to make clear, if there's a disruption, the disruptors will be asked to leave, and if they don't, they face discipline. And we have a whole protocol for that. And I think it's so important that campuses have policies that make clear that disruption speaker will be punished. You don't like a speaker, have a peaceful protest. You don't like a speaker, then bring in your own speaker. We had an incident a couple of years ago, this before COVID, where an Israeli Supreme Court justice was going to come speak. And our Students for Justice in Palestine chapter had indicated they were going to disrupt that. I met with the leaders of it and I said, if you do that, then we will discipline you. Figure a way to protest without being disruptive. They did, thankfully. They put a leaflet at every seat in the room. They handed out another leaflet to everyone walking into the room. The leaflets were quite inflammatory in their language, but I think it was completely appropriate because it wasn't disruptive of the speaker.
And the viewer may have been referencing the event last academic year at Stanford Law, where the federal judge had people that disrupted his speech, and the students were not disciplined there. Speaking of Stanford Law, my son's a student there, and they have a program they're initiating to bring students together of varying perspectives on a variety of highly controversial issues, to try and build dialogue instead of students retreating to their own echo chambers. And is this something that is happening at Berkeley Law to try and build that kind of cross-perspective conversation?
Let me answer yes, and then a qualification. Yes, I think at my law school, like at Stanford and others, we're looking for ways to teach constructive dialogue and looking for ways to bring people together who disagree. The qualification is, at this moment in time, not doing that with regard to issues in the Middle East. I think right now it's time when emotions are too raw, that when you think, as we were talking about earlier, there are those who strongly believe that Israel shouldn't exist at all, and those who believe the existence of Israel is essential. There are those on all sides who have loved ones in Israel and in Gaza. I don't think this is the time to try to find constructive dialogue there, though I think we should do so generally, and I look for the moment when we can do so as to Middle East issues as well.
We've had several of the viewers ask, do you believe the chant from the river to the sea is necessarily a call for the genocide of the Jewish people?
No, I don't believe that it's necessarily a call for the genocide of the Jewish people. I think taking literally what it says is that there should be a Palestinian state in all of the area that's Israel, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, I think is saying the same thing as we don't want no two-state, we want 48. But that doesn't necessarily mean genocide of the Jewish people. What my law students in Justice Palestine would say is something that you expressed a view of, not your view, but you said some hold that view, that there should be a Palestinian state in all that territory, and Jews can be part of that Palestinian state.
Yael says, Dean Chemerinsky, is it your position that anti-Semitic rhetoric on campus is permissible under the First Amendment? Would that be treated differently than other forms of hate speech, such as if it was racist hate speech?
No, my position, and I've said this in print for many years, I've said it on your program many times, is that hate speech is generally protected by the First Amendment, whether it's racist speech or anti-Semitic speech or homophobic speech. In the early 1990s, over 360 colleges across the country adopted hate speech codes. Although they were well-intentioned, every one to be challenged in a court without exception was declared unconstitutional. In part, they were declared unconstitutional because they were so vague in defining what's hate speech. But even more, they were declared unconstitutional because all ideas can be expressed. Hate speech, however vile, is still expressing an idea. So, of course, there's a time when hate speech becomes unprotected, as you and I were talking about earlier. If it does become incitement, if it becomes what the law calls a true threat, if it becomes harassment, but hate speech can't be punished by colleges, universities, certainly not public universities, without violating the First Amendment.
A number of viewers have asked if you think what Israel is doing with its military action in Gaza does meet the legal definition of genocide.
I don't think it meets the legal definition of genocide. I would very much express concerns about what Israel is doing in Gaza. I would also express that I'm uncomfortable judging it because I don't know enough about the military situation. I continue to be upset when I see how many children, how many civilians have died as a result of Israel's actions. But I think of genocide as the intentional destruction of a people on account of their race or their ethnicity or other characteristics, is what Germany did to Jews during World War II. I do not believe that is at all what Israel is engaged in. So I would emphatically reject characterization of it as genocide.
Renana asks, what do you think the role of social media is in fomenting anti-Semitism on campus?
I think it's a very significant role. I think that social media has become the place where hate can be easily expressed. And then when people see it expressed, it becomes legitimated. I think that there's been a real change in dialogue and discourse in our country since the development of social media. Much accounts for why that's happened, but I think that social media where hate is expressed helps further anti-Semitism and racism in our country.
Dan asks, is characterizing Israel an apartheid state anti-Semitic?
I don't think so. I mean, of course, what do we mean by apartheid? I think it's much more about criticizing the policy of Israel and not according civil rights and civil liberties to those who are, say, on the West Bank. So again, it's a rhetorical characterization, but I personally wouldn't consider it to be anti-Semitic. I would consider it much more as a criticism of a policy of Israel. That doesn't mean I agree that the characterization of apartheid. I'm just trying to answer the specific question. If you ask my opinion, would I consider that to be anti-Semitic?
Several viewers have asked, do you think university administrators are more tolerant of anti-Semitism than they are of anti-Black or anti-other groups of hostile speech?
Yes. I think that were some of the things said about race that were said after October 7th, more administrators would have spoken out against it. And one of the things I said in the op-ed that you mentioned in the beginning is that campus administrators should speak out against anti-Semitic or Islamophobic speech. just as much as they would speak out against racist speech. I think campus administrators were afraid to speak out against some of the anti-Semitism on October 7th because they didn't want to be perceived as taking sides, as being anti-Palestinian. And I think that campus administrators can criticize anti-Semitism without in any way lessening their criticism of Islamophobia or in any way taking a position against Palestinians.
We've had, we're getting tight on time, but a couple of viewers ask what are kind of related questions. Alan asking about the role of DEI programs in the support of Hamas. Hasn't DEI placed Jews in the category of white oppressors? And then another question about, isn't this really coming from the left perspective on campus, and what can we do about that? Your response to this?
I think we've got to start with why DEI is important. It's about the idea that campuses should be diverse in every way, diverse in terms of race and religion and ideology, that we want to treat everybody on campus equitably, and we want inclusion. We want people to be included and feel included. In that sense, I think DEI in itself is something that's noble and we should applaud. There are times, though, where DEI is taken too far and implemented in a way that we should be critical of. But that doesn't mean that the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion is wrong. Anybody who would defend what Hamas did on October 7th should be denounced. What Hamas did was horrific, and DEI shouldn't do that. I don't think DEI is anything about white oppressors. If it is, it's a misapplication of DEI. DEI is really about, we want to be diverse in our campuses. We want to treat everyone fairly and equitably, and we want to be inclusive. That is a concept is unassailable. Then we can talk about how it's implemented, and sometimes been implemented very badly.
I want to give you a chance to wrap things up and sort of look forward. I think one of the concerns many of us have, and the question we have is this a moment in time of rapidly escalating anti-Semitism about Gaza, and once the current events recede, that we'll see anti-Semitism diminish, or is this part of a bigger, longer term build up, and we're not going to see that receding? In closing, sort of how do you see it, and do you take any optimism for what you're seeing happening in the past couple of weeks on campuses?
Anti-Semitism has long been there. I think that in recent years, it's become more acceptable to express that anti-Semitism. And I think since October 7th, there's been a much greater voicing of that anti-Semitism. And so I'm very concerned about that. I worry that things aren't going to get better on campuses until things get better in the Middle East. Our students on all sides are so passionate about it. I'm very troubled by what ADL and law enforcement report about the rise of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. And here we're not talking just about criticism of Israel, its existence, but actual violence directed against Jews. My hope is that bringing all of this to light, including in discussions like this, is what will lead to the solution. And I think that campuses have to be a part of that solution in the ways that we've talked about. Being places where all ideas and views can be expressed, places where campus administrators condemn anti-Semitism, but also places where we really do provide educational programs for the people who are going to be the leaders and the opinion leaders in the future.
Dean Chemerinsky, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you for the discussion, and thanks to those who organized this for inviting me.
And speaking of those who organized, it's an opportunity for you to support with your tax-deductible contribution the America at a Crossroads series, which brings you important speakers like Dean Erwin Chemerinsky and vitally important topics like anti-Semitism and topics in the weeks to come. please go to the website of Jews United for Democracy and Justice, known as JUDGE, under that acronym, or to Community Advocates, Inc., and make your tax-deductible contribution, please, to keep these programs coming. Also want to remind you that coming up next Wednesday, January 24th, it'll be the New Republic editor Damon Linker, political analyst, opinion journalist, and author Damon Linker in conversation with the always wonderful Warren Olney. Thank you so much. We'll look forward to having you back with us next Wednesday at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 Eastern. Have a wonderful rest of your week.